In the summer of 1936, the world turned its eyes toward a city draped in swastikas and false promises of peace. Berlin stood as a monument to a regime that believed in the absolute supremacy of one race over all others, a government that had constructed an elaborate theatrical performance designed to convince the international community of its legitimacy and benevolence. The Olympic Games of that year were never merely about athletic competition. They were a calculated propaganda exercise, a stage upon which Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party intended to demonstrate the supposed physical and intellectual superiority of the Aryan race. Every detail had been meticulously planned, from the gleaming new stadium that seated over 100,000 spectators to the carefully orchestrated ceremonies that celebrated Germanic mythology and martial strength. The streets of the German capital had been scrubbed clean of anti-Jewish signage, temporarily hidden from the eyes of foreign visitors who might otherwise question the true nature of the regime. Foreign journalists were shown only what the government wished them to see, guided through Potemkin villages of tolerance and prosperity while the machinery of oppression continued its work in the shadows. Into this cauldron of ideology and spectacle walked athletes from nations around the globe, many of them unaware of or indifferent to the political dimensions of their participation. Among them were 18 African American athletes representing the United States, men and women whose very presence on German soil constituted a direct challenge to everything the host nation claimed to believe. They had traveled across an ocean from a country that itself denied them fundamental rights, that forced them to drink from separate water fountains and sit in the back of buses, that lynched their brothers and sisters with terrifying regularity. Yet they came to compete, to prove through the undeniable language of athletic achievement that the theories of racial hierarchy were nothing more than dangerous fantasy. The young man who would become the central figure in one of the most suppressed stories in Olympic history arrived in Berlin carrying burdens that no white athlete could fully comprehend. He had grown up in the American South during the depths of the Great Depression, in a small town where the color of his skin determined every aspect of his existence. The schools he attended were starved of resources, the textbooks outdated and falling apart, the facilities a cruel joke compared to those provided to white children. His family worked land they would never own, laboring from sunrise to sunset for wages that barely sustained life. Yet from his earliest years, there was something different about this child, a certain quality that teachers and neighbors noticed and remarked upon. When he ran, it seemed as though the very laws of physics bent to accommodate his movement. His stride was effortless, his speed seemingly limitless, his endurance beyond anything that could be explained by training alone. Local competitions revealed a talent so extraordinary that word began to spread beyond the boundaries of his segregated community. A white coach from a nearby college heard stories of this remarkable young runner and, defying the conventions of his time and place, arranged to observe him in competition. What he witnessed that afternoon would change both of their lives forever. The coach recognized immediately that he was looking at something rare, a natural ability that emerged perhaps once in a generation. Despite the legal and social barriers that made such arrangements nearly impossible, he began working with the young athlete in secret, meeting in the early morning hours before the town awakened to its daily routines of enforced separation. The path to the Olympic trials was strewn with obstacles that would have defeated anyone of lesser determination. There were no scholarships available to black athletes at white universities in the South, no training facilities that would admit them, no coaches willing to risk their careers and social standing by openly supporting them. The young runner pieced together his preparation through a combination of ingenuity and desperation, running endless miles on dirt roads while white athletes trained on modern tracks, lifting homemade weights fashioned from scrap metal and concrete, studying the techniques of champions through grainy photographs in old magazines. He entered regional competitions under false pretenses, sometimes claiming to represent institutions that had no idea he existed, other times simply showing up and demanding his right to compete. More often than not, he was turned away at the registration table, told that the event was not open to participants of his race, warned that his continued insistence would result in consequences he would not enjoy. But occasionally, through some combination of bureaucratic oversight and individual courage, he was permitted to take his place at the starting line. On those occasions, he did not merely win. He annihilated the competition so thoroughly that his times could not be ignored, could not be dismissed, could not be explained away by those who wished to believe in the athletic inferiority of his race. News of his performances traveled through the networks of black newspapers that served communities across the nation, publications that documented achievements the mainstream press refused to acknowledge. By the time the Olympic trials approached, he had become something of a legend within African American communities, a symbol of possibility in an era of systematic oppression. The trials themselves presented yet another series of hurdles designed to prevent his success. He was housed in inferior accommodations, given practice times when the facilities were least suitable, subjected to officiating decisions that seemed calculated to disadvantage him. During one qualifying heat, the starter's gun misfired 3 consecutive times, each false start forcing him to expend precious nervous energy while his white competitors were permitted to rest and recover. When he finally launched himself from the blocks on the valid start, he was already operating at a physiological disadvantage that would have doomed most athletes. Instead, he ran the race of his life, crossing the finish line so far ahead of the second-place finisher that timekeepers initially believed their equipment had malfunctioned. The official record of his qualifying time was adjusted downward by Olympic Committee officials who claimed irregularities in the timing process, a decision that would prove to be merely the first of many attempts to diminish his achievements. Nevertheless, he had secured his place on the American Olympic team, earning the right to represent a nation that barely acknowledged his humanity. The weeks between the trials and the departure for Germany were filled with a peculiar combination of celebration and anxiety. Within his own community, he was treated as a conquering hero, feted at churches and social clubs, presented with gifts collected through donations that represented genuine sacrifice from people who had little to spare. But the white sporting establishment regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and concern, uncertain how to present this undeniable talent within the framework of racial assumptions they were unwilling to abandon. Newspaper coverage of his selection focused on physical attributes described in terms more appropriate to livestock than to human beings, language that revealed the deep currents of dehumanization that ran through American society. The voyage across the Atlantic offered a brief respite from the pressures that had defined his entire athletic career. Aboard the ship carrying the American team to Germany, there were moments when the barriers of race seemed almost to dissolve, when the shared identity of Olympic competitor temporarily superseded the divisions that would reassert themselves upon arrival in Europe. He spent hours in conversation with athletes from backgrounds utterly different from his own, discovering common ground in their dedication to their sports and their dreams of glory. But even in this relatively egalitarian environment, there were constant reminders of his subordinate status. He was assigned to share a cabin with other black athletes rather than being integrated into the general team housing, served his meals at a separate sitting, excluded from certain team activities without explanation. When the ship docked in Hamburg and the team boarded trains for Berlin, the racial dynamics shifted once again, now complicated by the ideology of the host nation. German officials, operating under strict instructions to present a welcoming face to the world, treated the black American athletes with a politeness that many of them found disorienting after a lifetime of open hostility at home. There was something deeply strange about being accorded more superficial respect by the functionaries of a racist regime than by the citizens of one's own country, a paradox that several of the athletes would later reflect upon in memoirs and interviews. Yet beneath this veneer of courtesy, the machinery of surveillance and control operated continuously, monitoring the movements and statements of anyone who might disrupt the carefully constructed narrative of the Games. The Olympic Stadium in Berlin was unlike anything the young athlete had ever experienced. The sheer scale of the structure, the precision of its design, the overwhelming presence of political symbolism in every corner and corridor made clear that this was no ordinary sporting venue. Here was the concentrated power of a totalitarian state, expressed in concrete and steel and the roaring voices of over 100,000 spectators. The opening ceremonies had showcased the regime's talent for theatrical manipulation, with perfectly synchronized displays of patriotic fervor that both impressed and unsettled the visiting athletes. Now, as the track and field competitions began, the stadium became an arena where ideology and athletic performance would collide in ways that no one could fully predict. The event in which he had qualified was considered one of the premier competitions of the Games, a test of both speed and endurance that demanded exceptional physical conditioning and tactical intelligence. The German athletes entered as heavy favorites, their preparation supported by the full resources of the state, their victories essential to the propaganda narrative that the regime had constructed. They had been told since childhood that they represented the pinnacle of human physical development, that their racial heritage guaranteed their superiority over the lesser peoples of the earth. When they looked at their black American competitor, they saw not a fellow athlete but a curious specimen, an anomaly whose presence in the same competition seemed almost absurd. The race itself would become the subject of controversy that persisted for decades, its true outcome systematically obscured by those who could not accept what had transpired. From the moment the starting gun fired, the young black athlete demonstrated a superiority so complete that it transcended the boundaries of normal competition. He moved with a fluidity and power that seemed to belong to a different order of physical existence, each stride carrying him further ahead of competitors who had expected to dominate. The German favorites, so confident in their preordained victory, found themselves unable to respond to his pace, their carefully prepared race plans dissolving into desperate improvisation. By the halfway point, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The only question was the margin of victory, and that margin continued to expand with every passing second. The stadium, which had erupted in patriotic enthusiasm at the start of the race, fell into a stunned silence as the impossible became undeniable. Here was living proof that everything the regime claimed about racial superiority was a lie, that athletic excellence recognized no boundaries of blood or heritage. The young man crossed the finish line so far ahead of the second-place finisher that the gap seemed almost to mock the pretensions of Aryan supremacy. His time, even by the generous standards of the era, was extraordinary, a performance that should have guaranteed his place in the permanent record of Olympic achievement. What happened in the hours and days following that race would constitute one of the most shameful episodes of suppression in sports history. Within the stadium, as the young athlete stood waiting to receive his gold medal, officials huddled in urgent consultation, their faces betraying a mixture of panic and determination. The official results, which should have been announced immediately and recorded for posterity, were delayed without explanation. When they finally appeared on the scoreboard, something had changed. The winning time had been altered, reduced to a figure that, while still representing victory, diminished the magnitude of the achievement. More significantly, the name associated with that victory had been modified, the spelling changed just enough to create confusion, to make the accurate historical record more difficult to establish. In the following weeks, as official Olympic documentation was compiled and distributed to national committees around the world, the suppression intensified. Photographs of the medal ceremony were removed from circulation, the few that survived showing evidence of crude alteration. Written accounts of the race emphasized the performances of the European competitors while minimizing or entirely omitting the achievement of the black American champion. When the official film of the Berlin Games was assembled, the footage of his race was edited in ways that obscured the true margin of victory, camera angles carefully selected to suggest a closer competition than had actually occurred. The young athlete returned to the United States with a gold medal in his possession but without the recognition that should have accompanied it. The mainstream American press, taking its cues from the Olympic establishment and unwilling to challenge the emerging narrative, devoted minimal coverage to his triumph. The racial dynamics of American society ensured that even this diminished recognition would fade quickly, replaced by attention to white athletes whose achievements, while genuine, did not match the suppressed victory of their black teammate. The years that followed brought a curious and painful combination of private knowledge and public erasure. The athlete knew what he had accomplished in Berlin, carried the memory of that race in his body and mind for the rest of his life. The other competitors knew as well, some of them later acknowledging in private correspondence the magnitude of the defeat they had suffered. Spectators who had witnessed the race firsthand spoke of it in whispers, aware that the official version of events did not match their own recollections. But without documentation, without institutional support, without the willingness of those in power to acknowledge the truth, the suppressed victory remained exactly that, suppressed. The gold medal itself became both a treasure and a torment, physical evidence of an achievement that the world refused to recognize. He kept it hidden for years, showing it only to family members and close friends, unwilling to subject himself to the disbelief and dismissal that public display would inevitably provoke. His athletic career continued after Berlin, but the discrimination he faced intensified rather than diminished. The combination of his undeniable talent and the threat that talent posed to established racial hierarchies made him a target for systematic exclusion. Competitions that should have welcomed an Olympic champion instead found reasons to bar his participation. Sponsorship opportunities that would have provided financial security were denied, the companies involved unwilling to associate their products with a black athlete regardless of his accomplishments. He was forced to earn his living through manual labor, his Olympic gold medal hidden in a drawer while he performed the same backbreaking work that had defined his family's existence for generations. Decades passed, and the athlete aged into an old man, his speed long since faded but his memories undimmed. The world had changed around him in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1936. Legal segregation had been dismantled, civil rights legislation had been enacted, black athletes had risen to prominence in sports that had once excluded them entirely. Yet the suppression of his victory remained intact, the official record still reflecting the altered version of events that had been established in the immediate aftermath of his triumph. Occasionally, historians or journalists would stumble across inconsistencies in the documentation, anomalies that suggested something had been deliberately concealed. But without access to the original records, without the testimony of officials who had long since died, these investigations inevitably reached dead ends. The truth seemed destined to remain buried forever, a casualty of the political circumstances that had surrounded the Berlin Games. Then, in the late 1980s, an unexpected development began to unravel the carefully constructed deception. The collapse of communist governments in Eastern Europe opened archives that had been sealed for decades, records that contained documentation from the 1930s that Western researchers had never been able to access. Among these documents were files from the German Olympic Committee of the Nazi era, papers that had been captured by Soviet forces at the end of World War II and stored in repositories throughout the Eastern Bloc. A German historian, researching an unrelated aspect of the Berlin Games, discovered correspondence that referenced the deliberate suppression of results in several events. The language was circumspect, the officials involved careful not to state explicitly what they were doing, but the implication was clear. Certain outcomes had been deemed unacceptable, and measures had been taken to alter the historical record accordingly. The leaked documents triggered a cascade of revelations that eventually reached the specific case of the suppressed victory. Internal memoranda showed that the decision to alter the results had been made at the highest levels of the Olympic organization, with the explicit involvement of Nazi government officials who understood the propaganda implications of an unambiguous black triumph. The original timing records, which had been presumed lost or destroyed, were discovered in a subarchive, their figures confirming what the athlete had always claimed about the magnitude of his victory. Photographs that had been removed from official collections were found in private holdings, their images showing the medal ceremony as it had actually occurred, the young black champion standing on the highest platform while German and other European competitors looked up at him from below. The revelation of this suppression became an international news story, drawing attention to both the specific injustice suffered by this athlete and the broader patterns of racial discrimination that had shaped Olympic history. The International Olympic Committee, faced with irrefutable evidence of institutional wrongdoing, was forced to acknowledge what had occurred. Official records were corrected, the athlete's original time restored, his name properly spelled and his achievement properly documented. But for the man himself, now in his late 80s and in failing health, the vindication came too late to undo the decades of erasure he had endured. He lived long enough to see the corrections made, to hold updated documentation that finally reflected what he had always known to be true, but the years of unrecognized achievement could not be restored. The damage done to his career, to his financial security, to his sense of place in athletic history, was irreversible. The legacy of this suppressed victory extends far beyond the individual athlete who suffered its consequences. It stands as a permanent reminder of the intersection between sports and politics, of the willingness of institutions to sacrifice truth on the altar of ideology. The Berlin Olympics of 1936 represented the most elaborate attempt in modern history to use athletic competition for propaganda purposes, and the suppression of inconvenient results was merely one element of that larger project. But the eventual revelation of the truth also demonstrates the limits of such suppression, the impossibility of permanently erasing achievements that were witnessed by thousands and remembered by those who participated. The documents that exposed the deception had survived for over 50 years in archives scattered across continents, waiting for the moment when political circumstances would allow them to emerge into the light. The athlete's victory, which the Nazi regime and its collaborators had worked so hard to delete from history, ultimately proved impossible to erase. His gold medal, which he had kept hidden for so long, now occupies a place of honor in a museum dedicated to the history of African American athletes, its story known to visitors from around the world. Schools bear his name, scholarships have been established in his memory, and the full account of his Berlin triumph is taught to new generations of students who might otherwise never have learned of his existence. The regime that sought to use the Olympic Games to demonstrate racial superiority has been consigned to history's judgment, its thousand-year Reich lasting barely 12 years before collapsing into deserved ignominy. But the young black athlete who defied that regime with his extraordinary performance, whose victory they tried so desperately to delete from history, has achieved a kind of immortality that no amount of suppression could prevent.